Okay, so this video is going to illustrate the effect of the imposition of a tax, highlighting the fact that the legal incidence of the tax, who's sending the tax to the market, won't actually affect the economic incidence of the tax, or who really bears the burden, who is losing surplus. So we'll work through looking at the incidence of a tax when the tax is placed on suppliers, and then we'll say in an absolutely identical market, so these are the same supply demand curve, same initial price and quantity, we'll say, what if that tax were instead placed on demanders? How would things be different? Punchline is they won't be, but this is good exercise working through tax incidence, but also emphasizing this point that it doesn't matter who sends the money to the government, the burden of the tax, who's made worse off, who's losing surplus because of it, doesn't depend on who's actually sending the money to the government. So let's see, in this case, we place the tax on suppliers, and we know when you increase the cost to suppliers, it shifts the supply curve up. So the supply curve shifts up by the amount of the tax. This is a $1 per unit tax. The supply curve shifts up by the amount of the tax. And so as the supply curve shifts up, the $1 doesn't get all passed off onto the consumers, because some consumers are saying, I'm not going to pay that. So consumers start to leave the market, you can see, and so the price goes up, but not by a full $1. Because as the suppliers try to push that price off on the tax off onto consumers in the form of a higher price, the consumers start to leave the market. So the price in the market is this $3.75. The new quantity is Q sub T. So that's the new market, post-tax market price. That's the price that consumers are paying to suppliers. So the market price, the P sub T, the price after the tax, is that price consumers are paying to suppliers. But the suppliers don't get to keep all that, right? The consumers pay $3.75, so that's what happens in the markets. And consumers pay $3.75. There's only 60 units being sold now. They pay $3.75 a unit for the 60 units, and then that money goes to the suppliers. But then the suppliers have to send the tax back to the government. So they charge $3.75, then they send $1 back to the government. Remember, the difference between these two curves is the amount of the tax is $1. So they charge $3.75, they send $1 back to the government, so they only end up keeping $2.75. Let me make that green, just to distinguish it. $2.75. So the consumers pay $3.75 to the suppliers. The suppliers take $1 and send it to the government, so the suppliers end up keeping only $2.75. So the price consumers pay minus the tax is the price that suppliers get to keep. So in this case, suppliers are keeping $2.75 because consumers paid $3.75 and there was a $1 tax. So of the dollar tax, 75 cents of the tax is being paid by consumers, and 25 cents per dollar of that tax is being paid by suppliers. So the price consumers are paying went up by 75 cents, but the price suppliers get to keep fell by 25 cents. And that difference between them is the amount of the tax, the $1 tax. And so you can see the total tax revenue to the government is that dollar tax per unit So the tax revenue is the tax rate times the quantity that's sold after the tax. So it's $1 tax per unit out over all those 60 units, or $60. But of that tax, of that $60 tax, 3/4 of it is being paid by consumers because they're paying 75 cents more, and only 25 cents on the dollar is being paid by producers. That's the basics of where the tax revenue comes from. You just you can see that the supply curve shifted up by $1. So the question then is, and we'll talk more about the burden of the tax, and we'll talk some about this deadweight loss that we haven't gotten to yet. But the point I really want to make in this video is that that's what it looks like if you put the tax on suppliers. But what if you put the tax on demanders? We don't do this as much, right? You go to the store and you pay for a good and the supplier sends the tax to the government. But you pay some taxes out of your paycheck, like your tax for Social Security and Medicare, that thing that says FICA in your paycheck. Half of the FICA tax comes from you pay it, half of it comes from your employer. They pay half of it. And so sometimes we do have consumers or the individuals sending the tax to the government. Imagine for a good, it's hard to imagine with a good because this is just isn't how our system is set up, but imagine if you went to the gas station and in order to buy gas, you had to put in your gas tax card. Not too hard to imagine. And then you put in your gas tax card, then you pump your gas and the government keeps track of how much gas you bought, and then once a month or once a quarter it sends you a bill for your gas tax. That's perfectly plausible. There's no reason. We usually use suppliers to send the tax in because there's fewer of them and it's simpler. But what if, this is just to say, what if we put the tax on demanders? What if demanders were the ones that sent the money to the government? Would that make a difference? And the answer is no. The simple answer is, if we put the tax on demanders, then if this is what I'm willing to pay for the good, if I'm willing to pay $3 for that 80th unit, then if I have to send $1 to the government and it's worth $3 to me, I'm only going to pay suppliers $2 for it. So this is what the good's worth to me. So what I'm willing to pay to suppliers, given that I have to send $1 to the government, is going to be $1 lower everywhere. So it's going to look something like this. Demand after tax is willingness to pay. You can think of it as, I'll say it this way, willingness to pay to suppliers, given that you then also have to send the tax to the government. So the demand curve shifts down everywhere by the amount of the tax. This is what it's worth to me. So this is what I'm willing to pay suppliers, because then after I pay the suppliers, I have to send the money to the government. And you can see, and we didn't use actual equations here and things like this, but you can take my word for it and you can see it and you can prove it to yourself. But it doesn't matter. If we shift the demand curve down by $1, the difference now is the same decrease in quantity, but the difference now is the market price is $2.75. That's what consumers pay to producers. So the amount of money that transacts in the market is $2.75. The market price, PT, now is the price that suppliers receive. And then after I pay $2.75 to the suppliers, then I have to pay that dollar tax to the government. And so I pay that dollar tax to the government. And so I end up in total as a consumer paying $3.75. And the tax is the difference. So there is no difference in the sense that in both cases, quantity fell to 60, consumers are paying 75 cents of the tax, producers are paying 25 cents of the tax. It doesn't matter who you put the tax on. You can either say the tax to consumers, the consumers pay this price, then suppliers send the tax in and that's what they keep. Or you can say suppliers get this price and then consumers pay the tax and that's the total they end up paying. It doesn't, you can see these are exactly the same equation. It's just if you should subtract the tax, there's no difference. It doesn't matter who you say is sending the money to the government or who actually physically sends the money to the government. Whenever you place a tax in the market, what's going to happen is output will happen until that distance between supply and demand is exactly the amount of the tax. So demand could shift down by $1 and your new equilibrium post-tax quantity would be where the new demand curve is $1 lower than it was. Or supply could shift up by $1 and your new post-tax quantity. Again, it's where the difference between supply and demand is exactly $1. You could shift supply up by $1, you could shift demand down by $1. You could, like the FICA tax, shift supply up by 50 cents, shift demand down by 50 cents. It doesn't matter. The new post-tax situation quantity is going to be where the supply and demand curves are exactly $1 apart from each other. Because you'll keep producing as long as people are willing to pay enough to cover the cost of production and the tax. Once you get to the point where the supply and demand curve are exactly $1 apart, beyond that, an additional unit is worth less than $1 more than it costs to make. So it's not worth enough to pay the cost and the dollar tax. And so units will only get made out to 60, out to the point where willingness to pay is exactly equal to what it costs to make plus the tax. So it doesn't matter. Again, the consumers pay 75 cents on the dollar of this tax. Tax revenue is still the same, $1 per unit over 60 units. Consumers are paying the purple part. Suppliers are paying the green part. The legal incidence of the tax, who sends the money to the government, doesn't matter at all. And that's why a lot of times when we do tax analysis, we just say, here's the tax wedge. And we don't say suppliers are paying it and shift the supply curve up, or demanders are paying it and shift the demand curves down, because that just makes our graphs more cluttered, really. And it doesn't matter. That's not what determines who bears the burden of the tax. What determines who bears the burden of the tax? Elasticity. And we'll talk about that in our next video.